This week we're going to be talking about conscience. There is a whole lot of information I want to talk about conscience, but since we're doing this online, I have to shorten it all up. I'm going to give an abbreviation of what will be discussed in class. The first thing you want about conscience is, what is it? Well, your textbook reading pages 123 to 125 will talk a lot more about what conscience is and is not. But one little thing about conscience I have to mention is many people think that conscience is that little voice inside of your head that's telling you what to do. It's kind of like the Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio. And it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's not entirely inaccurate. Conscience is that little voice inside of you that's telling you what to do, that's moving you toward a better direction. However, your conscience can be wrong and erroneous, which we'll talk about in a minute. On page 124, there are 3 blue sentences that I want you to focus on. It speaks about what conscience is. Read those sentences, know those sentences, and I want to point out 2 very important aspects. Number 1, conscience comes from God. It does not come from ourselves. It is not inside of our own persons. Rather, it comes from something greater than us. What makes this so important is it keeps conscience from becoming moral subjectivism. Whenever conscience comes from the person, it is moral subjectivism. Right and wrong is completely dependent upon, completely determined by, what the person thinks right and wrong is. Conscience is not moral subjectivism. Rather, it is a divine voice placed inside us by God. Because of this, your conscience is not exactly the same as what you think is right and wrong. One thing I want you to know is that your gut can be wrong. Many people think that conscience is following your gut. Like, my gut tells me I should do this. My gut tells me I should do that. Your gut is helpful, but it's not always right. Your gut can be wrong. The second thing I want you to know about these 3 points is that your intellect is very, very important. Your gut is an instinct. It's a snap decision. This is what I think. However, conscience is a bit more than that. With conscience, you need to use your intellect. I once knew a man, he left his wife for another woman. He and his wife had been married for many years, and they had a very happy marriage. They had quite a few kids together. But whenever he met this other woman, his gut was telling him, I feel like I should leave my wife for this woman. I feel like it's the right thing to do. He said to himself, I have to follow my heart and be with this woman. Now, he used his gut in the situation, but if he used his intellect would tell him that he had pledged his life to his wife and to his children. He had given himself to her. His intellect could help form his conscience. Therefore, you must use your intellect whenever using your conscience. Now, you are able to have an erroneous conscience. The word erroneous means incorrect or twisted in the wrong way. Think of warped. Warped's a good way to put it. Now, how do you get a twisted or warped or erroneous conscience? An erroneous conscience is where good seems bad and bad seems good. It's the Thanos scenario, where killing half the universe is a good thing. It's a right thing. It is the moral thing to do. You see this all the time, and if we look hard enough, we can see it inside of ourselves too. There's one quote from the textbook, I really like it. It's an example. This Native American once said, my conscience is like this triangle inside my heart. Whenever I do something wrong, the triangle spins and it hurts. My conscience hurts me. But the more I do wrong, the more the triangle spins and the edges of the triangle wear down, and it doesn't hurt so bad anymore. The more we ignore our conscience, the more we go against our conscience, the easier it is to ignore our conscience. The conscience is like a friend who's frequently ignored. Have you ever had a friendship where you do all the communicating? You do all the texting, you do all the messaging, you do all the calling. They never initiate first. You ever been in a friendship like that? I know I have. And one thing you'll see in all those friendships is that whenever one person always does the initiating, sooner or later, they're going to get tired of doing all the initiating, and they're going to stop initiating. Whenever you ignore a friend, the friend will eventually get tired of that, and sooner or later, the friend will start to go away. The conscience is the same way. The conscience is like that friend that if you consistently ignore them, they'll just stop talking. The way to get your conscience to shut up, the way to get your conscience to stop bugging you, is to just ignore it. In life, there's a lot of times we want to do something, but our conscience is eating at us. Like, I really want to, but man, my conscience is telling me I shouldn't. There's a way to get your conscience to stop talking. It's just to ignore it. You ignore it again and again and again, and sooner or later, your conscience won't talk to you anymore. And that is how you get an erroneous conscience. Now, when it comes to conscience, you must always follow your conscience. Following the conscience is the most important aspect of knowing right and wrong. The conscience is the central key component of the moral life. However, an individual must form his or her own conscience. There is more about how to form your conscience on your textbook on page 130. Do read that. That's very important. I'm going to talk a little briefly about how to form your conscience. One thing about a good formed conscience is you look outside yourself for wisdom. Remember, moral subjectivism says, I am the author of what's right and wrong. And if you're the author of what's right and wrong, then why look anywhere else? If you know the answer, you don't need to ask anybody else for the answer. A good conscience recognizes that I am not the author of right and wrong. I must look outside of myself. Remember, conscience comes from God, and why that's important is because when you form your conscience, you're asking yourself the question quite frequently, what does God want? Constantly asking, what does God want? What does God seek? What does God desire? You're not asking yourself the question, what do I want? Because if you ask yourself the question, what do I want? A lot of times it's a selfish answer. What I want is what benefits me the most. It's a form of ethical egoism. But a good formed conscience, being outside of oneself, will allow that individual to really seek something greater than themselves. And the conscience will truly feel like it's from God and not just from your own moral subjective feelings, not from whatever your gut thinks it should and should not be. The final thing today, I'm going to give you 2 tips, 2 steps to becoming a moral person. The best moral person you could possibly be will follow these 2 steps. Step number 1, do not ignore your conscience. You'll see in the Dan Ariely video that you're to watch this week. And what happens is we want to look ourselves in the mirror and say, you know what? I'm not a bad person. I'm a pretty good person. Yeah, you know what? I'm not perfect, but I'm not too bad. We all want to do that. And every human being wants to think of themselves as good. But people do not turn into devils overnight. Never, ever settle for, it's not that bad. I mean, yeah, it's wrong, but it's not really that bad. Never, ever tell yourself, well, you know what I'm doing is wrong, but at least I'm not as bad as that person over there. That is how you get to a bad conscience. People do not fall off the cliff when it comes to conscience. They slowly walk down the steps toward hell. A bad conscience will slowly erode. You keep your conscience to a high standard. If your conscience tells you something is wrong, don't say, well, I'm not going to do the worst possible thing, but I'm going to do kind of something that's not so bad, but just a little bit bad. And the Dan Ariely video shows that people cheat, and they cheat just by a little bit. And that is how the conscience slowly erodes. You'll see this in your own life. Have you ever completely and absolutely and totally cheated on a test? Like everything, you just cheated on a test. Most people actually won't do that. Most people, they'll cheat, and they'll cheat just by a little bit. A few questions here, a few questions there. And they'll say, yeah, I cheated some, but I get most of it was me. What that does is it slowly turns us into devils. If you want to be a person of high character, a great human being, you hold your conscience to a high standard. You never tell yourself it's not that bad. The second step for forming your conscience, the second step to becoming a great moral person is using your intellect and your humility. Your humility says that I am not the author of right and wrong. Your humility says my conscience doesn't come from me, it comes from God. And knowing that, you will use your intellect. You'll use this God-given thing inside of your head to actually try to figure out what's right and wrong. That's why your intellect was given to you by God, to know the good, to know God. And so a great human being, a great moral human being, will use their intellect because they have the humility to know that I am not the author of right and wrong. Take these tips, use them in your own life. This week, I'm asked you to do the reading, watch this and the Dan Ariely video, and submit your check for understanding questions. Until next time, happy Easter, and God bless you all.